Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday session. Date is 15th of June, 2005. 25. Going back in time. All right. We have some brilliant guests today, Karen Jarling and Stuart Andrews. They live in the Mary River region, which is near Gympie, Queensland in Australia. And they're here to talk about landscape function and what they're doing on their properties and what is happening around Australia. So welcome, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
And also Kevin from Western Australia, the usual suspect, sitting in the corner there with his multi-species. Okay, so we were just discussing before about how things change and what's needed to take place. So this leads on to, if you're sitting there for too long in procrastination, it may lead to avoidance. So today we're talking about the landscape function, and we have been discussing keeping the ground covered. Both of these are really important for infiltration. And Stuart will go into why landscape function is so important at the very, very beginning, because other things may not be working. I feel procrastination is actually a very, very important place to be. I'm going to take it in more of a positive action rather than a negative action. You need to be able to plan and organize yourself so that the outcome that you end up achieving is one that you desired. If you jump in the deep end, if you haven't thought about it, if you haven't procrastinated about it and just delayed it or postponed whatever it is that you're doing, there may be things that you do that cost you in the long run. So although the actual definition of procrastination is that you're putting something off and it could have a negative consequence because you're doing that, there could also be a negative consequence if you jump in too quickly. And so what happens, though, when it turns into a negative thing is that you end up avoiding. And this is more of a mental coping strategy, that if it's all too difficult, putting contours on land or planting multi-species or all of the things just start to get too much for you, the best way that you deal with it is to avoid it. And I'm sure we've all done that at some stage. And this is usually attributed to a feeling of overwhelm, when there's just too many things going on. And it may not just be your farm, it may be your personal life, it may be the weather, it may be all these other variables that come into play that create your procrastination period to go from being positive into a negative experience. But I just wanted to sow that seed that it is a good thing to procrastinate over something as long as you don't avoid doing what you are setting out to achieve. So there we go. Who would like to start on this venture today?
No, I'm happy to go. Whatever order you're in charge, you just tell us how you want it to roll.
Yeah, but also it's a very relaxed session. So if you want to interrupt, feel free. Should we play a video to start with then?
Sure.
Should we do your farm in New South Wales?
Yep.
All right, let's go for this. Have the warm up.
So do you want me to talk over what's going on?
Yeah, you can do, and I can pause as well. We'll run through and then, I can pause as you're talking.
Yeah, so this property is near a little town called Rylestone in New South Wales, Australia. And we purchased this property, one, because it was at the top of a watershed. Maybe just roll it through and just pull up on one of maybe the first contour. Yeah, that'll do. We purchased it. This is obviously a very dry period here, so compared to the other ones where there's been rain. So we purchased this property because it was at the top of, well, it's actually the top of two watersheds. One watershed, one part of the property flows into the Murray-Darling. The other part of the property flows into the Sydney water catchment area. It had been running sheep for a long time. Management was probably what I would consider to be questionable, typical standard sort of management. And a lot of erosion had happened. My guess is that it had had sheep, overgrazed, rabbits, probably in the 50s, and then erosion followed. And so a lot of these hills were, particularly these ones here, which were western facing, were highly eroded. And not this particular site, but a little bit further around the corner from there, when we started working, some of the gullies that had formed in there were deep enough that when we put a D6 dozer in them, you couldn't see the D6 dozer in the gully. Now, remembering that it's just water flowing off the side of the hill. It's not an actual flow path. It's not a concentrated area that formed over time. As soon as the water started concentrating, it started to erode. So we had some pretty major problems there. And the other thing about this property is it's all clay. Where we started all our work was at Tarwin Park. It was predominantly a sand or a sandy loam type soil. So people would say, oh, well, we can see that it works here in this sandy loam soil, but what about if you're in clay? What about if it's steep country? So that was the other reason for purchasing this property when we sold the other property, was to, well, let's put it to the test. Let's trial in clay, and let's be on steep country. So this is just showing you how we started doing some of that work. And on these photos, you can see two different styles of building the contours. The top contour, you see that the machine, which in this case was a bulldozer, pushed from uphill downhill. And you can see as a result that the area where the dozer removed the soil first is still not vegetated, which is a negative. And that was just the machinery, the person who came in and did that particular one, that was the machine they had, and that's how they wanted to operate. They didn't want to work around the slope, which is how I would like to do it. And then the contour, the next one down from there, you'll see that's one that I've built. And it's not nice and neat like the top one, but it's more functional. And the important part is that it vegetated up very quickly. Within a year or two, as soon as it got rainfall, that whole system vegetated up. So, well, there you go. It's in the same year. So 2020, and it's starting to get vegetation on. By the time you get to 2022, they're fully vegetated. The one at the top was built in 2014, still hasn't vegetated. So how you go about, constructing these things is quite important. Some landscapes you can get away with doing, you can be more rugged. In a landscape like that, you can't be, because you're talking very shallow topsoil, and then you're into the subsoil, which we all know subsoil is very hard to grow a lot of plants in there, other than your primary colonising ones. So, yeah, that was looking at that particular site.
That's really interesting, because I did notice that there was a difference, but I couldn't see what the difference was. And as soon as you said he went from uphill, pushed down, I was like, yeah, that's what he's done. Okay.
And you'll find that a lot of machinery operators will work like that, because their aim is to have everything looking neat. Well, of course, we all know that nature is not necessarily neat. It's neat in the terms that, oh, it's neat. That's really neat what it does, but it's not neat. It's usually untidy and messy and rough. And I guess that's where I fit in to the landscape, because what I build tends to be a little bit rougher, but it's more functional. It's designed around how quickly can we get plants back into the system, because with no plants in the system, it isn't working. It doesn't matter what you do. And, contours, I think, people might think that, they can put a contour in and everything's good. They've done. No. The contour is only going in there because you don't have the plants in the system to be able to manage it. And it might be briefly, post a dry time, you don't have the plants. And so your contour is there to manage the water when it turns up, to start what we call kickstarting the hydrology. And so you want that bank to kickstart the hydrology, because the next thing that comes once the hydrology is functioning, you've got your plants growing. And at the end of the day, it's all around plants. The amount of green surface area we can grow on our landscapes, the more functional we will be.
And going to you, Karen, then, if we take a look at your aerial shots of the dam on your property, can you talk us through what years we're looking at here and what you actually did?
Yeah, the photo of the empty dam was very, very early in 2020. 2019 was an awful year for our area. It was just so windy, so dry. There were fires everywhere in 2019, 2020. And we had only owned the property for 3 years at that stage. We didn't have any history on the property. The previous owner had died before we purchased it, so we weren't able to get any background. The dam in the dry time there, we'd already had work done on that dam, because when we purchased it, right where the little orange canoe is, there had been a breach in the wall. We put that down, and it was through livestock movement. And we were assuming that there'd been erosion formed in that point down a cow pad. And there was truth in that. But it wasn't until probably 2 years later that we understood that it was actually a breach point from overbanking of the dam. And that had probably been happening since the dam was built, we don't know when, 50 years ago, something like that. The catchment, when you follow that dam headwater back up, it goes into our state forest land that's on our boundary. The catchment out there is enormous for the dam, the way that it was constructed in that photo, in that form. So the overbanking had probably been happening for the entire life of that dam. And it also leaked. None of which we knew when we bought it. It was all a surprise. Not a nice one though. So when we had the big floods then in 2022, I think it was, the dam overbanked again, and we were like, this just can't keep going on this way. We have to have a solution. Not sure whether you remember, Tam, but when we used to drive around near that old rusty tank that's there, the little vehicle track used to be on the outside of that tank, and you used to go down through quite a sharp little dip. If you move on to that full photo of the new look, yeah, where those she oaks are now, that gully used to come across, and that was the dip we used to drive through, was where that gully continued down. And you can see further down there, it's the top of some other she oaks that were part of that gully as well. I understood that we needed to divert the water out of that gully because it was just channelizing further and further down. I didn't understand the scale that would look like, but when we connected with Daniel Lawton from the permaculture world, where water management is just, it's almost the top of their principal tree, and he could do the maths required to work out the catchment that was coming out of that forestry area on a 200 mil rainfall event. That was the maths that we didn't know. We didn't know what that would look like, but he could do the calculations and work out how high the wall needed to be, how long the overflow needed to be, and the fact that it now actually has 3 exit points as opposed to one narrow one. All of those things we probably knew or understood at some point, but it was the finer details of that and executing it that was beyond our capability. Ever since Daniel did the very first rough-in of the work, because of course he landed there and it started to rain. He had 3 days to work before it just got too wet. But the rough-in of where things were going to go was enough to show that it's working. It's not pretty. It was very stressful, but it's working, and it's never once failed. It just, you can still hear water occasionally if we have an intense hour or so of rain, but within an hour that's subsided. You can't hear it roaring for a day and a half anymore. So it slowed the water down. Every now and again it gets a trot up, but it doesn't run anymore. Most of the time it's at a very steady walking pace now, which has taken all of the pressure off of the gullies to cope with that water now. It goes downstream into another dam. That dam has also been re-engineered to have a more adequate overflow. Again, it's got 3 points of water can escape should we have an insane rain event, a rain bomb. They happen. Haven't had to go there yet, but it's all working. We now have water, as you can see in that main new photo, we have water that's backs up into that gully. It backs up and is held up. There's two reasons there's water in that gully now. If you go to that full photo, Tam, yep, you can see there's water backing up in there. Well, yeah, that's dam water backing up in there, but we also have a series of little tiny leaky weirs, beaver dam type constructions further up in there that hold water further back in that gully where it's coming down off of the hills. We think that gully is a man-made in erosion gully. It was only a 70 mil rain event, which is not unusual for our part of the world. Early on, when we were only a couple of years in, we definitely had increased the ground cover. We'd done all of those sorts of things. It was all moving forward slowly, but we were still in those very dry years, so it wasn't what it is now. 70 mil rain event. As soon as it stopped pelting down, we raced out the door to see where the water was going. The water coming off of our hills and where it hit that flatter country was almost knee deep. So there's a little tiny depression that forms at the bottom of the hill, and that water just courses down there with no management of livestock. They go to where the sweeter grass is, so they're hammering that gully then in the drier times, chasing the sweeter green grasses, and the amount of water that's coming off the hills, the animal impact. I'm quietly confident in saying that that's a man-made gully. It shouldn't really be there. It's just eroded over time with water movement and animal impact. So now it's fenced. We do have cattle in there from time to time. But overall, it's stable now, and it's increasing the fertility in that area. It's increasing the shade in that area. And by holding the water in various forms, it's also hydrating that area, because we thought that the lower country would be where the better soil was. There's no topsoil there. It's you could make pots out of the clay that we're working with there. But it grows an immense amount of feed now. And is only going forward. What I
love, Karen, is looking at this, and you have a preconceived idea of what a dam looks like, and it's round and it's got a bank around the lower part of it. And then when you have a look at how it's now functioning, it's an arm. It's a long area of water. And of course, when you really look and think and understand, of course, that's going to work better.
Yeah, and it's actually it's very snake-like now, because it comes out of the forestry, it does a right-hand turn, it comes into our dam, it does another right-hand turn, it goes out of the dam, it does another right-hand turn. It's a remediation of a damaged seasonal waterway. It's not really meant to have water like that in it. It certainly wouldn't have been like that 100 years ago. It would have just been a dry gully that ran water for a few weeks during the wet season. That would have been it. We've done the best we can with what's there to stabilize it and to make it more functional. We could have flattened it all out and just left it go back to a dry gully, but we do need a water source. So it's a remediation.
And this is what we've got to understand, is that landscape function is about improving what we've got the way it is right now. It's not about what it was. We've got to deal with what it is. And like Stuart said, it's actually trying to build those multi-species plants, whether they're native or whether we've planted them or whether they just pop up after 10 years. However we are managing, that's what we're aiming for. Where should we go now? What photo? I'm liking the fact that you have to manage, and you have to actually go with the land that you've got.
very much. And what we have is what we could afford to buy. And it was in terrible shape. We probably didn't realize that. We'd been driving past this place for 20 years. But moving at the time that we did showed all the cracks. We were in like a 5-year declining rainfall pattern, and really it couldn't have been any worse than those first few years. We were well and truly panicking because we didn't know whether we could make it better. It was so bad that we really weren't sure we could do this. We thought we were going to be in starvation central for forever, sort of thing.
Mm.
In my heart, I was like, it works. I know it works. I've seen it work around the world. It has to work. It works in other places. This has to work. But when you're neck deep in hardship and a lack of experience to a point too, like we'd done a lot of things before we got here, but every place is different. And I think you've got to have a fair few runs on the board. Like we only moved 9 kilometers. We thought, 9 Ks, what's the big deal? Same climate, same rainfall, same everything. No, every place has got a different lesson to teach you, and you've got to have a lot of experience across a lot of landscapes before you can walk in and go, nah, it'll be right. We'll work out a plan for this property that will work. You've got to have a lot of different topography, different climates, experience behind you before you can say that confidently. And we didn't. We knew this area, we knew this region, but this property was absolutely new to us. And it well and truly made us doubt whether we had anything in the toolbox that was going to do enough. It was that bad.
So Stuart, you are listening to probably the same story that Karen's telling you as you travel around with your Tarwin Park training with your natural sequence farming. How do you go about that initial, for farmers or anybody with land, to say, procrastinate for a little bit, but you've got to get started at some stage?
Yeah, one of our couples that have done our course, what she described was they did our course, they went back to their farm. They did the course in Sale in Victoria, yet they live at Springshaw in central Queensland. So they went as far away from their place as possible with a completely different landscape. So, of course, going back to it's always difficult. And the way she described it was paralysis by analysis, So, you learn so much stuff and then you get stuck not knowing what to do. My advice to anybody with anything is start small and just do a trial. It doesn't have to be, you don't necessarily know whether it's going to be right or not, but you just give something a go and trial it and determine whether it is going to be right for you. Is it right for your animals? Is it right for your landscape? Whatever, give it a go. And I think that's an easier way to start. Karen and Warren, their difficulty was moving to a place that they were starting from scratch again, because that property had not been managed the way that they had been managing their previous property. So you're going back to the start and starting again.
And it didn't rain either, Stuart. When we finally did see some rain, we were like, okay, we're good. But when it wasn't raining, that was very, very hard.
I don't think it's anybody, none of us on this call can actually make it rain.
No.
So what we can do, and that's the big thing about, what we talk about, is having your landscape ready under any circumstances. And, we talked before we started where, a lot of people will focus on getting their grazing right, which is imperative. You must have your grazing right. Without having that right, you're going to be up against it, full stop. But, there are times when no matter how well you graze, you are impacted by either a broader weather system or by how other people around you are farming. And so to insulate yourself, you need to be ready, knowing that your landscape is going to deteriorate. No matter how well you manage it, is going to deteriorate because you're going to be affected by all those other things. So having it ready that when it rains, you can make sure that you can hold on to as much of that water as possible. And, you know, that's a key, I think, for people to understand that that's your aim. That's why you're grazing the way you are. That's why you would look to put in contours or, you know, dams, ponds, whatever, to enable you at that point where the landscape is most sensitive, being able to respond. See, a lot of the time, all the time, I see it. After a dry period, usually when it rains, you're not usually fortunate enough that it rains gently. It normally comes in a big dump. And what happens is most of the water that comes in that first rain event runs away, which means you've just missed the one opportunity to get growth. It's gone because that water went down the gully. If you can have something set up that enables you to hold onto that water, even if it's only for an extra hour, for an extra half a day, for an extra day, it gives it a chance to get into the ground, because unless it's in the ground, it's not growing plants. And you need it in the ground because you need plants, because at the end of the day, plants are the winners of everything. Plants are the solution for everything around. All of these other things that we talk about are about getting plants growing. So that image you've brought up there now, that's a property west of Charleville in Queensland, southwest Queensland. That's a pretty arid sort of landscape. When I went out there the first time, it was like, holy shit. How are you guys actually making a living out here? Now that particular property is 170,000 acres, so it's a fair lump of a property, but the numbers of animals that they can run on that large acreage is very few because of the fact that it's so dysfunctional. Now, when I went there, this particular site, the landowners explained to me that this was a clay pan. I went, okay. So we'll go out, well, let's go and have a look at it. Well, I looked at it, I read the landscape, which is what I do. I said, this is not a clay pan. This is a floodplain. This is a floodplain that doesn't work anymore. So at some point, in the past, the animals more than likely have not been well managed. This was the sweetest country, the country that held feed for the longest, and it was overgrazed. As a result, it's become dysfunctional to the point where it grows virtually no plants. So any water that falls on there runs off. I was amazed, really. It was an eye-opener for me to see that this country, even though it has a elevation change of probably a metre. Can you go back to there's another one looking at the whole site.
With the three contours.
Yeah. So that first one, the first two images were when we first went out there, and I came up with a plan with these guys as to what we could do to start a process. All we're doing is starting a process, not a silver bullet. We're just starting a process to try and get plants back onto the system. And the limiting factor was not nutrient. A lot of places, like here on the coast, it can be nutrient deficient because of the amount of rainfall. Out there, it was the reverse. The lacking component out there was water to be able to grow plants. The fertility, there's tons of it in that country. It's a beautiful country, but it's just dysfunctional. So how do we hold the water on this landscape for a little bit longer to get some more plant growth? So that first one was when we first did the work. The second photo that you showed underneath was when, after I think 10 mils of rain. This one here was this year. Just go back to that one again.
That one? No,
back to where you were.
the first one.
That one there. So that one there they had 300 mils of rain out there this year. One rain event came down through the central part of the state, and these guys got 300 mils. So their normal rainfall is 380 mils, and they had 300 mils in one rain event. Now, so for that country, which sheds most of its water, it can be quite significant, quite damaging. But this particular site was ready. It was ready to take some of that rainfall in. And as you can see, it's now starting to get some growth on it. So that's the start of the process. If you can just flick through to where it's showing that some of the diversity of plants that are growing there, because this is what we're aiming for. Just flick past, we'll come back to that one. These ones here. So, a lot of the times we talk about putting cover crops on, which are fantastic for helping to build soil and getting the landscape to function. Well, these are nature's cover crops. These are the plants that nature puts in place so long as the landscape has an opportunity to do it. So these plants all turned up. A number of these plants, these guys said they've never seen in their life before.
Wow.
So they've come because those seeds were sitting in the soil. They were just waiting for an opportunity to grow. They just needed the conditions to change, and bang, they take off. Now, the other thing you can see in there are the cracks in the soil. That's something else on that particular landscape, which is predominantly clay, needs to happen. The landscape needs to crack open like that so that it allows infiltration. That is the recharge. That's how that landscape restarts the hydrology, because the cracks open up in the ground and then the water goes in and the landscape wets from the bottom of the crack back to the surface. Where currently all of our farming practices are about wetting from the top down, which is the reverse. It's the reverse to how our landscape works, or particularly these clay landscapes. So what we're trying to do, helping these guys, is to start the cracking process. And then the things that we've done, the contours, become irrelevant. They're not necessary anymore. Once you get that cracking and the plant's growing, job's over. We're done. But the contour sits there, innocently sitting underneath, like you saw in Karen's shot, sitting underneath all the grass, sitting there waiting until such time as the conditions reverse, because it's been a dry period, and bang, they start to work again. That's the role, and so on this landscape, it's probably transforming it a little bit faster than I anticipated. I thought we might be a 5-year proposition. Instead, it's really started to respond in 2 to 3 years, which is good. I mean, it's obviously driven by rainfall. But yeah, so, this is a common mistake, calling these things clay pans. It undervalues what they actually are, or at least were. They were floodplains. We all know how vibrant and fertile floodplains are. Well, that's what these are. Can you just shoot to the other one where it shows the mulga, please? That one.
And that could maybe just reflect in, if you're the buyer or the seller. If you're buying it, you want to downplay it. If you're selling it, you want to upsell it.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, for sure. If you see this, about this, just above center of that image, there's a line that goes out through the mulga. That's a contour line out through that country. Now, that country, which is what you would call the sloping part of that landscape, the area where the bigger contours were, is the flatter part, so the floodplain area. These are the slopes. There's not much elevation change. So what most people have an image of a slope. It's not really a slope, but it is. It's falling. The water is falling off of there down towards the floodplain. So that's a contour line out through there to help manage that water running off of that landscape. The government's data says 90% of the water that falls on that red landscape runs off. 90% of the water that falls on there, even though it's vegetated with mulga, it's unhealthy. It has very little growth at the ground level. So you need something in there to start the process to get that vegetation back on the ground, so that you've got that ground cover on there. And it's fairly dramatic. It's not easy to do that. These guys have been working with grazing for a long time, but they've got a huge amount of scale. And it's very hard for them to be able to do it, and they're not seeing the responses. So they wanted to trial something else to help speed it up. And that's the beauty. These things together, a well-managed grazing system and utilising contours to help manage the water, they are a complement to one another, and a perfect way to help get landscapes functioning.
Kevin, do you want to add about multi-species in this scenario?
Yeah, and that, this is that whole thing of systems approach, that, whether you're, I'm rotational grazing, or I'm zero till or min till, or whatever system that you want to box yourself in, it's the whole system. And, Jay Fear has one of the best quotes that I've heard is, plants fix dirt. So that, yes, we need water to get everything growing, so we get that water to stop. In Western Canada, we call it fill and spill system, so that this way we're slowing down that water, allowing that water to give it every opportunity to infiltrate. when we start dealing with monoculture grasses, or in shrubs or trees or whatever we have growing, now we have one root system. And the one of the pictures I guess you could bring up is from Paul in northern Saskatchewan, where it's very rolling terrain, and within 3 years we reclaimed 50 hectares of his land out of 80. Dramatic, just by stopping that water running off the hill slope into the swales. We had the taproots, we had the chicories in the ground, we had the shallower rooting system, we had some tubers in there, something to crack that soil. Exactly what you said about that swelling clay. The clays dry up, they open up. Now you have the water quick to infiltrate. They can get in there. They'll rehydrate that clay. They start to swell and they close up, because that's where it wants the water, is in the soil. And by having these taproots, and whether it's lucerne, whether it's lupins, the chicory, getting those longer term cracks in the soil, really crucial on how to get these soils rehydrated and fixing these micro water cycles. And Nicole Masters, she talks about not the fact of how much rain did you get, how much did you keep. And so this is exactly what we're all talking about, is where do we keep it, and where in the landscape do we want it? When you talk to Haggerty's, they talk about getting the biology going, and now they have native species that are growing on their farm that people thought they disappeared 50 years ago. But once again, the soil, the biology is waking up. Now we're getting the natural progression of the species expression, I guess be the right word.
Yeah. So we've got a lovely close-up of one of these, what I would classify as a swale. This is on Karen's farm, but you can see it's actually very difficult to compare when you don't know what it was like, and if we were just seeing the overgrown photo on the right. But luckily for me, I was actually on farm back in August 2021 when it had just been done, and or before they had the rain. And so in the background, to orientate yourself, on the photo on the left, there's this gum tree that sort of is expressing itself with 45-degree angle branches. And then if you look at the photo on the right, it's still there, sort of almost in the middle of the photo. And so I'm pretty well almost in exactly the same place, and that was taken just last month. And you can see the difference. And Karen, would you like to talk us through what happened between those years?
Yeah, it's been so interesting to watch these contours coming to life. On the right, on the May 2025 photo, you can see there's a little fluffy looking tree that sort of pokes up in the closer foreground on the actual outside edge of the contour there. It's right beside that gum tree that you're talking about. That's a little pigeon pea plant, which is a legume, and we threw a heap of seeds out just by hand. We didn't fuss with the contours at all. But there's she oaks that's growing there now as well, and they that's closer up. They are all helping to build fertility in different ways. I was looking at that montage of photos there, that collage rather of photos that Stuart was showing with all of these plants that have volunteered. We've done experiments of different sizes, and we've put out seed, but we're not hung up on growing any one thing in particular. We just want to grow stuff. And I was looking at that collage, and all I could see was all these different leaf shapes and how beneficial that is to have that diversity. And we're looking at there, and it looks just like you say, an overgrown mess. Sometimes we don't get our grazing 100% right. We still have our farm jobs. We're still developing this property, so we haven't finished putting in contours, roads and fences, things like that. it should have been grazed before it got to that stage. It's been very, very wet. We're not going to risk damaging our contours to graze them just because they're looking a little messy. We'll hold off. We'll do it in August. We're not too worried about them looking like that. When we do graze it, all of that material will get squashed down and it'll get trampled. We'll add some manure, we'll add some urine, and all of that will continue to build that fertility tank that runs across our hillside. The she oaks are a native plant. By rights, they shouldn't be that high up in our watershed because we're quite a long way from our creek, the main creek in our part of the district, the permanent creek. Historically, you wouldn't have seen them there, but I've chosen to plant plants for what I want the environment to look like. I want that to be a watercourse. So I'm planting plants that will eventually be supported by a semi-permanent waterway running across my hillside. It'll dry out. It is, it's dryish now. There's still a few damp spots in it, but it's planting for what you want, encouraging the plants that will do a job. At that day we had when Alejandro was here in May, Tam, I showed you some of my teacher weeds, but I've also showed you some of my weeds that are one of our crops. Cobbler's pegs are one of our multi-species. We love to see when we've got a big patch of cobbler pegs coming through because they are so energetic in what they do. They don't hold back. They go hard. They freak people out, but I know that in 2 years' time, I'm going to see a massive amount of more acceptable fodder. They still get eaten by my animals, but I know that they will do a job. You can see there in the very foreground, there's a little, we call it wild cotton bush, little balloon seed pod on it there. The number of people who freak out when they see that they've got a crop of those coming through. What I mentioned on that day when we had everyone here was the pollinators that we've had on this farm, because we've had plants like that, because we have the cobbler's pegs, because we have the stinking Roger, because we have Scotch thistles, the pollinators that we see, the actual insect life that we see is nothing. We had no animals here when we moved here, and now we have all of this other livestock that's doing amazing jobs for us. So yeah, we're happy to see whatever plants want to grow along our contours in our paddocks. They're all there doing a job. Yeah, our banks, we did our work with a grader. These were all installed by a grader. So our banks were a little bare, like the one that Stuart was showing in his photo as well. But we've made a point of shepherding the grasses and very gently impacting them at times until we did get that grass cover down onto, because it's subsoil. We have no real topsoil here. We're building it. There's nothing here to work with. So it's been a bit of a process. We have got them all covered now. There's none that are anything like that. Our dam work, again, it was stark. We called it the Great Wall of Glastonbury because it was this huge clay monolith that we built in our paddock to deal with this water. But you can't even pick it now. There's so much grass on it. And again, we've shepherded the grasses along. We graze it. We don't hold back on that now. It's definitely part of our grazing routine. You just have to, I call it pulsing. Sometimes you have to take your foot off the gas, another time you have to have your foot on the gas. So we very much monitor what it needs and what it will handle. Don't overdo it when it's still in the baby stages. And then looking after it in our climate for when it's wet, because the drier times are actually easier to manage in some ways. The wetter times, you've got to really make sure you're not overdoing your grazing on our soil anyway, because we've got clay and it goes to slush very easily. Because we don't have our carbon where we would like it yet, our soil carbon. Soil carbon's very mobile in our very wet climate. We were doing quite nicely while we had a run of dry years, and then we had a run of wet years, and our soil tests show that it's dropped again. So it's all fluid and it comes down to having a commitment to your management, whether it's wet or dry. Just because you're having a good season doesn't mean that you can be sort of lackadaisy. You've still got to have an eye on what's going on. So we're happy with our contours, and we're so happy we put them in. It was terribly nerve-wracking at the time. We did have the good fortune to have Peter Andrews come to the farm when he was in the area visiting with other people. Seems like such a long time ago now. And that gave us the confidence to do it. We'd been sitting on the fence for a good while, but we were starting to see some results from all of the other tools in the toolbox. So we're like, right, this is the big wrench. Do we pull it out of the toolbox or don't we? So we decided to do it, and yeah, very easily the best thing we've done on farm, because we're talking about water and available rainfall and how much you're capturing. I remember very, very early on, we'd only been here for maybe 18 months, but we were already into our grazing rotations. And I'd said to the children, they were only little guys at the time, I said, come on, we're going to walk across the back and we're going to move those cattle over into the next section. I said, oh, do you think it'll rain, Mum? I said, put your raincoats on just in case. And it did. It just misted with rain. It was the finest fairy pea rain while we were away. And we were gone for a couple of hours, taking the kids, doing something outside. We didn't rush it. And I remember walking up a little slope and looking at the dead grass that was pushed down onto the ground. It was the year before's mulch essentially pushed down. And our biology was so ineffective and there was so little rotation happening that this tiny fairy pea water was sitting on top of that mulch. And there was obviously like a little waxy film, and I've seen it on our soil. I hadn't realized it happened on grasses as well, where you get a capping in the grasses from the bacteria, the little waxes that they make. And here was this tiny fairy pea just sitting there and running over the surface of this mulch. And I thought, that's it. We're never going to get there. This is how it's going to be forever. But it did get better. We got out and higher as we had more grass and things like that. But I looked at the gauge when we got back to the house and we'd had 2.5 millimeters. And I thought, and that's going nowhere to do anything good for anyone, sort of thing. Even that tiny light rain was sliding off our hillsides. So as I said, it's been an interesting learning being here, that's for sure. And the lessons just keep coming. So it's observation is such an important part of what we've, done here, and then procrastinating for a little while to see where it might lead us and then figuring out which tool to use.
Positive procrastination.
That's the one.
Yes.
Positive procrastination.
It's a new term.
You'll have to trademark it.
Yes. I love that story though. That's such a beautiful image that I've got in my head. Stuart, I want to just pull this one up because it's now a contour filled with water.
Yep. So this is out at a place called Glenmorgan in south central Queensland, I guess, south from Dalby. And this the owner of this land, he'd done our course and he just purchased this place. I think he'd only purchased it 12 months or maybe 2 years before. And he decided that he needed to be able to manage his water at the same time as getting his grazing right. The landscape had been managed differently to the way he was going to be managing it. And so he wanted to get infrastructure in from the start. So he's gone full tilt in putting his fences up to get his rotations going. And he wanted the contours in from the start, all of that CapEx, as he calls it, all done, ready so that the landscape can start to respond. And so this is after, I think from memory, this was a 20 mil rain event. A 20 mil rain event, you would normally expect, I would like to not see any water in contours. But that just goes to show you that's the condition of that particular landscape at that point in time, that had the contours not been there to manage that 20 mils of rain, that water would have gone. It would have run away. And the other thing that I think a lot of people don't consider is, what does the water move? The water is always moving nutrients. So it moves the soluble parts of your nutrient, Worst case scenario, it could move soil. In this case, it probably was moving some soil because there was a reasonable amount of bare soil on this particular property. So it probably was moving soil. When you've got something in place like these contours and ponds and so forth, then it only moves as far as there at the very least. So you're aiming to get none of the soil moving. The nutrients will always move. There'll always be a portion of your soluble nutrients moving. And if you can restrict how fast they can leave your property, that nutrient is what's going to grow your next round of plants. So you do not want that leaving your landscape, if possible. Now, if you could go to the aerial shot, please, Tamzin, that same spot. No, keep going. Must have been further along, I think.
9. Is it?
The one where it shows that long contour. Yeah, that's it. Very good. Now, if you look at you can see the contour line. It's about center of screen at the bottom, and that contour line's moving towards the top of the screen, and it curves off to the right, and then it does a sharp turn back to the left. And that's when it does the sharp turn back to the left, that was showing the image of where that contour had water in it. Now, what that's indicating is that's a gully or a flow line at that particular point. So this contour system is able to manage the water that would be coming down that gully. Now, that water coming down the gully is coming from the neighbour's place. Now, if the neighbours, depending on how the neighbours are managing their landscape, they could be distributing a lot of fertility off of their landscape into that gully. Now, with this contour system, this landowner is able to take some of that mobile fertility out into the contour system to start using that to build their landscape. And so once you've interacted and you've linked your gullies or your flow lines back to your broader landscape, that's what would have happened naturally a long time ago before any human started interfering with the plant's role. So the plant's role, I'm sure people have seen many times, where if you have a rain event and you've got plants out there, you'll see, go back out after the rain's stopped, and you'll find all of these little organic matter rows that have been built by the moving water up against plants. And what it's built is exactly what you're looking at there. It's built contours, except the contours nature builds are only little. They're usually only, maybe 25 mils, an inch high. They're small little contours, but they're doing the same thing. Nature is trying to spread the water out so it slows down, and it uses the plants to do that. So the plants are there, the organic matter builds against the plants, which causes the water to pool initially, and then it starts to move sideways. And so in the times when we lack the plants, that's where your contours come into play. So the contours can then start to spread that water back out. It won't matter today how much we work on our grazing and so forth, we will never see the water come back out of those gullies again, because the incisions that have been cut by our previous management are preventing that from happening. So a lot of gullies that are carrying water and fertility just keep carrying that away till it moves to the ocean, and it never gets spread back out onto the landscape, giving it a chance to grow more plants. This is one system that will help with achieving that. The day it rains, it's ready to go, and it will start moving the water and fertility back out onto the landscape. The aim of the game is to grow more plants. Now, what plants you grow is all determined by your management, what you want to do. Where Karen's put trees on the bottom side of a contour, that's exactly what we would aim to do. You would have a contour line with trees growing along there. What sort of trees could you have? Determined by obviously your area, but how much water exists by what plants you can grow. Karen talked about the fact that she's got she oaks, which are traditionally a riparian plant, now growing up near her contour because she's created a situation where now those plants can grow in that landscape, where before maybe they couldn't because it was too dry. So you're creating an environment where you can grow plants where before you were not able to. Now, it's interesting because I went to was asked to go to a fire meeting locally yesterday, which I didn't stay at for very long, because a lot of the focus was on, well, one, it was on burning, which it's a tool, but it's a tool that I'd rather keep in the toolbox most of the time. But the other thing is a lot of the focus is on growing native, so Australian native plants. Well, a big portion of the Australian native plants that people grow are ones that burn. And why is it that we are promoting growing more of these plants? Because our landscape is so dry, we can't grow any others. So we must get our landscape functioning well enough so that it has enough moisture in it so that we can grow plants that don't require fire. It's just a matter of changing the conditions. We change the conditions, we can change the plants. So these contour systems, that's what it's about. Create an environment where you can grow different plants. And hydrology is the driver of everything. You don't have hydrology, you don't have plants. So the first thing you want to do when it rains is you want to kickstart your hydrology however you possibly can do that. And all we're doing with contours is mimicking nature's little contours that it builds with that organic matter that I explained earlier. If no one's seen that form, then next time you have a rain event, go out into your paddock, go onto your lawn and have a look and see how nature organizes all that organic matter into little contour lines. And if you look down at that, it'll be just like that image that I showed you were looking down at the contours that we build across the landscape. It is no different. It's exactly the same. And you are just replicating that. So it's not building some man-made structure out there because some human decided that it was the right thing to do. It is replicating what nature would do if it was given the opportunity to do it. But unfortunately, nature can't do today what it needs to do because we are on there with our production systems, which holds it back, prevents some of that stuff happening. And that's just a fact of life. We have to have these production systems. We must have the animals. We must have our cropping. And so we have to work out what is the best way to integrate both. So nature gets what it needs, and we're able to produce food, which predominantly most people are producing food, so that people can live. That's the facts. That's where we're at.
So it is quite amazing that there is absolutely no talk about dehydration of landscape wherever you go. It seems to be either people don't know about it or they just don't understand it. I have a feeling they just don't understand it.
I think it's also a given. It always rains. It always rains at some point. So even if you've been in a dry time, it rains, and when you're in the dry time, you're going, "Oh, geez, this is shit house."
I don't know what you think, Stuart, but Dorothy McKellar's poem about a land of droughts and flooding rains, people seem to cling to that as some sort of, I don't know, badge of honour, that's what we have to accept as being normal for Australia. But it's like you were saying about your clients with their clay pan. That's been an accepted element of the landscape for white history. We don't know what it was like before Aboriginal history, let alone before white man moved there. So it's this acceptance that this is how it's always been, so that's the way it's always going to be, that I find a bit puzzling. I'm just like, we bought this place. We had it assessed by some local experts. Not that I believe what they were telling me, but I just wanted, quite frankly, if I'm honest, I wanted to prove them wrong, because I knew it wasn't going to stay at their assessment level. I knew we would get it forward. Yeah, I had doubts at times when things got really hard. But why would I accept that this property that I've invested my life savings into would only ever be worth the production that they were forecasting? Like it's an insanity. And again, those people, because that's the photos you're showing today at Charleville, was it, with the big clay pan? And you were saying about how low their stocking rate has to be because it's so sparsely, populated with suitable grasses and feed, why accept that that's as good as it's going to get? That's what does my head in. I just don't understand why procrastinate for so long that it becomes a negative, and that this is just how it has to be. This is how it'll always be, or it'll only get worse. Or I don't.
Can I see the powerful stuff? I think, at least, which makes it easy for me to talk about what I talk about, is because there's nothing we talk about that there's not already evidence of that happening in the landscape. So it's not, none of it's made up. And so let's go back to what you just said about the fact that people accept, the land of droughts and flooding rains. And I think some ways it's an insurance policy for our own mental health, because if we accept that it goes dry, then all of a sudden it wasn't our fault. We weren't responsible for that happening. When it floods, oh shit, that wasn't our fault. It wasn't because all the water ran off of our landscape because we don't keep it covered. It wasn't our fault. It's just natural. And it also fits nicely into the scenario that every time something dramatic happens, like a flood, like a drought, like a fire, all of a sudden we can dip into the purse of the taxpayers to recover from it, rather than deal with the fact that we are responsible for that happening. Now, so let's go back 40,000 years. And this is the evidence that proves that the landscape is not what we believe it to be. Because 40,000 years ago, this landscape supported megafauna, which were massive animals that needed a huge amount of fertility, a huge amount of plant life to survive. So why is it that we now have a landscape that would be flat out supporting a megafauna, any megafauna? So it just proves to you that our landscape has gone backwards. Now, the other thing, which can be a little bit, some people can get a little bit offended by, that it's every human is responsible for the decline in this landscape. It's not just whitefella. It's any human, every human around the planet. Again, there is evidence of this all over the place. There are landscapes out there around the world that used to be food bowls that are now deserts. Why? Because humans went on there and introduced the same sort of practices that we are using today. We've created deserts all around the world. It just depends on how close to ruined it was when we started as to how quickly it ends up a desert. So we don't need anything more. The evidence is there. The evidence is there that this landscape was massively abundant. So if it was able to be abundant under the conditions that it's been through, then we can get it back to being just as abundant again. But we must focus on what were the patterns, what were the principles, what was going on that built that landscape, and we just have to replicate those. The production systems then you can overlay over the top. And so getting the hydrology functioning is one of the key things. I hear all the time people talking about these beautiful soils we see everywhere that were built by grasslands, and the grasslands were managed because Aboriginals were burning that landscape to keep it, functioning and cycling. That landscape was built in a time when it was wet, and the type of plants that were growing in there are not the ones that we are seeing today. Those plants are gone. They were predominantly wetland type plants that built those landscapes. When the landscape started to dry, the grasses that we're seeing out there today said, oh, beautiful, I'm going to grab onto that. That's where I'm going to grow. And it created exactly the right place for those to grow. And Christine Jones, she talks about this. It blew me away when I was listening to one of John Kemp's podcasts he did last year, where they were at a day that Christine Jones, I think it might have been the last day Christine Jones did, and she said to them, this landscape was not dominated by grasses. This landscape was dominated by herbs. And it's like what's wrong with you people? Why is it that you're focused on because it's what we want. We believe grasses are what we want, so we then tell ourselves that's what built this system. It's a crock of shit. It is not what built the system. It was biodiversity that built the system. There is no landscape out there survives forever on grasses alone. I mean, you go into central Queensland. I remember going up into there back in 2012, 13, and one of the conversations back then was about this pasture dieback. And I said to them, the reason you're getting pasture dieback is because you've got no diversity. You've got one species of grass. I don't care if you've got 10 species of grass, it's still one, which means that your landscape is in decline and it will collapse. And so the only way nature can deal with it is it puts something in to remove the monoculture. And that's what happens. So that happens everywhere.
And it's species, not varieties. We
Correct.
need that species diversities. And that's what drove me crazy in WA when, you know, they talk about the diverse pasture blends of 5 ryegrasses and 2 clovers. That's 2 functional plant groups.
Yeah.
I lost a lot of hair over that.
Yeah, I can see. You know, it's interesting. You know, the first thing we need to do is we must get landscape function. Then we must get the plants into the system however we can. Now, nature will throw all sorts of plants at that to do that job. Most of them you'll probably spend time fighting to get rid of them because you don't want them in there. But our role as land managers is to ask nature. I say, oh, so you're putting that plant in there, like Karen talked about the sticky beaks. My God, that is such a magnificent plant. But people will spend time trying to eliminate that plant. You get 2 years of that. Guess what happens next? You end up with bloody grass. That shit you can't get rid of, you know? And so, you know, that's all of these plants are there. And so whether we introduce them through cover crops, that's our in-between. I think that's what people will do in that in-between time when they're trying to really kickstart their soil and they haven't come to the conclusion that weeds are actually okay, you know?
And we very much use both. We use some multi-species cover cropping, but we don't do our whole farm every year. We don't have a set cycle that we do this paddock at this time of the year. Our soils are still on the improve, so we have to still be opportunistic with our weather conditions. But if we don't get to an area, and we will see, it's not if we see, but we know now we will see a dominant plant come through. It'll be different in different parts of the farm. It'll be different from year to year. But we've gotten to the point now where we just are curious. Who's going to come through? Who is it going to be? The cotton bush this year? We've actually started seeing stinking Roger high on our hills. We've only ever seen that in 1 or 2 places on the property, and that's literally where we see a lot of vegetation build up on the edge of a waterway. And it's only been in 2 spots, really. We're seeing stinking Roger grow high on our slopes. Have never seen that before. So, yeah, while we do use multi-species in a deliberate form, we're still very happy and very curious to see who our volunteer multi-species will be in different parts of the farm as well. So that's really interesting because that will appeal to a different insect group. Those insects then will feed a different bird species. We saw no birds when we first lived here. So now it's okay, well, what's that going to bring to us? What creature is going to be able to benefit from that? We'll still graze it. It'll still be grazed. It'll still be turned into soil food, soil ground cover. But it's a different element again. So it's really interesting to see those volunteer species as well.
And it influences and directs the soil biology. So that these indicator plants, and you know, I've been talking about using your weeds as an indicator of what's happening in the soil for years, and that's that whole thing of when we start seeing changes and we have the diverse multi-species growing, it will change with landscape. It'll change with the year. It'll change as our soils and plants will both succeed at similar rates. And so this is that whole thing, and it all starts with water. What are the 3 free things we have in agriculture? Sunlight, air, and water. And you know, what's the easy way of managing water? Not having it run off the field or the paddock so quickly. Let it infiltrate, store it in the water. in the soil. So absolutely, like knowing what's growing, what does that mean? So now you're seeing a wet loving riparian type of plants growing higher on the slope. That means your micro water cycle is now functioning. So 2 thumbs up for that one.
Yeah, well, that's just this year, and it was a really big surprise to see that so high in the landscape. Sorry,
There's one other one, Kevin, that you should add to your arsenal of free things that we get, and it's not thought about ever, and that is gravity. And so when you are not able to manage water, you are not managing gravity. Gravity has the ability to build your landscape or destroy it. Sunlight has the ability to build your landscape or destroy it. Water has the ability to build your landscape or destroy it. How it's managed is the determining factor. All of those things, how you manage them determines whether your landscape builds or dies. End of story. So they're the 3 things, the 3 key things that we should be looking at. How do we manage? And it's easy to manage all 3 of those. All 3 of them are managed by exactly the same thing. At the end of the day, we want to be able to get green plants in the system because they're the best or the only thing that can manage sun. And so if you can capture sunlight with your green plants, well, guess what? They will also help you manage the other 2 components, gravity and water. And so all we're trying to do is to get a landscape in a position where it's able to support the plants. They're always the heroes. Sometimes I think people seem to think that they're the heroes, where in actual fact, the only thing that is a hero in this whole story are plants. And then other people will talk about their animals or think about their animals as being their heroes. No, they're not. The animals are there. Their role is to manage the plants. Their role is to recycle the plants, to turn the plants from an organic product into another product that the next plant can then use or biology can use. And so they are just like everything else. They are a tool. They are a tool in your toolbox. Plants are that's it. They are the beginning and the end. You need plants and you need as many different species as you can possibly get in there. And then you've got a system that will function.
We are nearly wrapping up, but I think it's really important, this side of fire management and being scared of wildfires. And there's a misnomer that regenerative farming, because there's so much ground cover, it's actually, they need to cut it back because of the fire risk. But what they're not talking about is what's going on underground with the hydrology and the rehydration of landscape. So Stuart, can you just sort of talk us through a little bit about why regenerative farming or increasing the hydrology in your land means that we actually decrease fire risk?
Yeah, so I mean, it once again, it stems around our plants because our plants are always the heroes. But if we have our hydrology functioning, then we've got a longer time where we have green plants in the system. Now, fires are always going to happen. It's just part and parcel of the way the earth evolves. If we don't utilize plants and recycle them with our animals, then nature will choose another way to recycle them. And quite often the way it's recycling it is with fire. However, fires in nature would most of the time tend to be smaller in their ability. They were not able to spread as far because the landscape was not as hot, and there were more areas where it was greener because it was wetter. And that would mean that a fire might start somewhere where it was drier. It moves through, comes into contact with an area that is wetter and greener, and the fire goes out. Unfortunately, today, most of our landscapes are dry, which means a fire could start in Western Australia and burn over all the way to here if someone didn't get in and intervene. That's what we've done. We've created this landscape of both fire-loving plants, and we've created landscapes that dry out for longer than they ever used to because we don't have a hydrological system that functions. and we can't maintain green plants. I mean, this was some of the conversation that I had hoped to have at the fire discussion I went to yesterday, but of course it wasn't a willing recipient of people, so I got up and left actually. But because at the end of the day, you only want to be talking to people that want to hear what's a solution. Well, we've got all of these massive eucalypt forests now. Most of it probably through human intervention in one way or another. How do we manage for those? Well, the easy management is to get our open country, the country that we are utilising day to day with our production systems, getting that growing green plants over a longer period of time. That's the easy fix, because that means that we've got a small water cycle that's functioning. Small water cycle creates a large water cycle, which means your landscape is constantly wetter rather than drier. A wetter landscape can't fan a fire. A drier landscape can fan a fire. So there's number one. That's an easy fix that all of us can do, and we could start tomorrow. You can start today if you want to. You can start that process. The next thing is, how do we insulate our eucalypt areas, which will burn? It's not a matter of if they burn, they are going to burn. At some point, they're going to burn. How they burn is the important part. So what could we do? Well, we can insulate those areas by creating buffers of green vegetation that doesn't burn. Fire retardant. There's native vegetation. Even if you're insistent on native plants, there are native plants that are fire retardant. Why are they not growing? Because the landscape has become too dry to support them. So we've got to set up a system where we could be growing bands of fire retardant vegetation, at the very least at the base of all of these eucalypt dominant forests, or even better, strips throughout the eucalypt forest. So these are all manageable. The fires that we see today, and the scale of these fires, are driven only by the way we manage our landscapes. Get our hydrology working, get green plants. We must, if we are running a cropping system, which most of our landscape that's dry is cropping landscape, not grazing landscape. Most of it is cropping landscape. What can we do? We can do exactly what Kevin's talking about, growing green cover crops during the periods of time that we are growing a crop, that we are a monoculture crop that we are going to look to harvest. Mm-hmm. By doing that, we now have a green plants in a large part of the landscape that would naturally be getting very hot. And so we can keep that landscape cooler. So when a fire starts, it's easier to manage it because it hasn't got the heat driving. I think, does that cover it for you, Tamzin? I think that's a pretty simple way of thinking about it. I don't know why this has to be difficult. It shouldn't be difficult. This is all relatively easy to achieve. And the other thing too, cheap. If it's expensive, then we're doing it wrong. We need to be able to do this, and we need to be able to do it at an economical rate. That way everyone can do it. And we don't need government to pay for it and support it. This should be all part of our day-to-day production systems. It's about getting our landscape functioning. We're going to be the winners at the end. Our productivity will pay for it. It just might take a little bit of time. The way I like to get people to think about it is, do you value a fence on your property? And the answer would be yes, you do, because it gives me the ability to manage my livestock. By managing my livestock, it helps me manage my plants. Simple. Okay. So if you value water and you value hydrology, then why is building a contour system or whatever it might be, why is that any different to building a fence? It's not, because it's now giving you the ability to manage all of the same things again. So it should be part of your management system, which insulates you for those periods of time when it's either too dry or too wet or there's a fire. And by getting the management of the dry and the wet, guess what? We have less of the fire. That whole landscape of droughts and flooding rains and fires, the fires was something that we introduced. That wasn't part of the makeup of this landscape at all. This landscape burnt over only over a very long period of time. I think the major fire cycle in Australia was 300 years. It's now every 2 years or thereabouts.
And
That's
that goes back to about a month ago when you had your three: simple, complex, and complicated.
Yeah, that's right.
Language.
Well,
Yeah.
Stuart, that's what you were a demonstration in that live. I don't know whether you've seen it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what I'm trying to do is to get people who are regeneratively farming, doing the right thing, rehydrating their land, need to have a weapon in their belt that says, for people saying, look, you are a fire risk because look at all the growth that you've got on top of your land, they need to be able to come back with, you're only looking at what's on top of the land, not what's underneath. And
but see, every landscapes, every land manager is different, but there will be parts of someone's landscape that's managing their grazing well. There'll be areas it should be like a mosaic. So some areas may have shorter growth and other areas longer growth. So if you think about that on a bigger complex, a bigger landscape, it's no different. It's the same thing, but you're creating it on your own farm. So there's areas where fire might speed up because of the extra cover you got on the ground, but then it comes to an area where it's shorter and all of a sudden it slows down. It's no different to the water. If the water just runs fast, it's a problem. If it goes fast, then slow, fast, then slow, fast, then slow, fast, then slow, not a problem. It's all working fine. So the fire is no different. You're looking at buffering it. So these regenerative farms, someone might drive along the road, and I mean, you got to ask yourself, why are these people being critics? They're only being critics because they don't particularly agree with the way you're farming. It's got nothing to do with whether you got a fire danger or not. That's a crock of shit. It's just, people make excuses for why they don't want to do something that's confrontational to them and to their beliefs. And that's fine. I get that. That's not a problem. But don't make excuses and say that this person's going to cause this because they did that. It's no different to the same argument. The bloody Andrews, they grow weeds everywhere, so they're no good, because they grow weeds. Well, that's your opinion. It's not it should not matter. So people who are managing their landscapes well and maintaining growth will have buffers in there throughout their whole system, because that's the way they would be managing that landscape. So even if a fire did start, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of times when it does, they have the appropriate tools in place to be able to manage it. So they can keep the landscape greener for longer, and some areas short and some areas long, and it works just fine.
Beautiful. What a lovely way to finish. Thank you, both of you, Stuart and Karen. And of course, Kevin, thank you for coming in with your little bit of multi-species every now and again. It's good just to keep it back in the flow, in the cycle. And so if that's it for everybody, big thank you. And we will see you again in another 2 weeks. So just keep tuning into the Sunday session. Had a fantastic morning this morning. Thank you both, Stuart and Karen.
No worries.
Thanks, Tamzin. Thank you.